We opened this series with a claim, and now it's time to examine it in full detail, that the Torah contains within itself a working distinction between universal law, binding on all humanity, and covenantal law, binding specifically on the people of Israel. Let's do this carefully because it's a theological hinge the entire series rests on. Genesis 9, following the flood, records God's covenant with Noah, and through him all of humanity descended from him. The Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin 56a works out 7 categories of obligation understood to be incumbent on all people from this point forward: the prohibition of idolatry, the prohibition of blasphemy against God's name, the prohibition of murder, the prohibition of theft, the prohibition of sexual immorality, the prohibition of eating a limb torn from a living animal, and the positive obligation to establish courts of justice. Maimonides codifies these formally in the Mishnah Torah, in Laws of Kings, chapters 8 through 10, and states the theological stakes explicitly. Any Gentile who observes these 7 laws because they recognize them as commanded by God, not merely as good ideas arrived at by independent human reasoning, is called a Chassid Umat Ha'olam, a righteous one of the nations of the world, and has a share in the world to come. This is Maimonides, arguably the most authoritative codifier in the entire legal tradition, stating in plain legal language that righteousness and ultimate reward are not restricted to Jews. They are available, by the Torah's own account, to any human being who takes universal moral law seriously. Now, set this beside the covenant at Sinai. There, God does not add a handful of new universal laws for all humanity. God gives one specific people who had just left Egyptian slavery, who had a specific ancestral history running through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, an extraordinarily dense and detailed body of law. 613 commandments by the traditional count, first systematized as a fixed number by the Talmudic sage Rabbi Simlai, and later organized comprehensively by Maimonides in the Sefer HaMitzvot. These cover not only the ethical territory already addressed by the Noahide Code, but an enormous additional layer: dietary law, the laws of the Sabbath and festivals, the laws of the temple service and priesthood, laws of ritual purity, laws of agricultural tithing tied specifically to the land of Israel, and much more. This is not a different, better version of the universal law. It is a different order of obligation altogether. What the tradition calls a brit, a covenant, a specific relationship entered into by a specific people carrying a specific mission, to be, in the language of Exodus 19, a mamlechet kohanim v'goy hakodosh, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, on behalf of the rest of humanity, not instead of it. Here is the analogy I find clearest, and it maps directly onto the structure of this entire series. Universal law is the foundation everyone stands on, the moral architecture available to any human being by virtue of being human. Torah law is not a taller version of that same foundation. It is a specific structure built on top of it, undertaken by a specific people who accepted a specific additional set of responsibilities. The way a doctor takes on the general ethical obligations every person has towards other people, and then adds an entire further layer of professional obligations specific to medicine, without the general ethical layer disappearing or being superseded. A doctor is not better than a non-doctor in some general moral sense by virtue of having more rules to follow. The doctor has taken on a more demanding, specific role in service of everyone else's well-being. This has been an important consequence for how we should think about the relationship between Judaism and every other serious moral or spiritual tradition, including Hermeticism. If universal law really is universal, genuinely available to all humanity, prior to and independent of the Sinai covenant, then it should be no shock and certainly no threat to find fragments of it, sometimes startlingly precise fragments, showing up in Egyptian Hermeticism, in Greek philosophy, in the moral intuitions of cultures that never had contact with the Jewish people at all. That is not evidence against the Torah's account. It is exactly what the Torah's own account predicts. The 7 Noahide laws are not a Jewish possession being generously shared with outsiders. They are the Torah's own description of a law that was never exclusively Jewish to begin with. What does remain distinctly non-negotiably Jewish on this account is the covenant, the 613, the specific mission of Israel, the specific relationship entered into at Sinai and carried imperfectly but continuously for over 3,000 years. Recognizing genuine moral overlap with Hermetic philosophy or with any other serious tradition does not dissolve that distinctiveness, any more than recognizing that doctors and non-doctors share ordinary human ethics dissolves the distinct obligations of medicine. The two claims sit comfortably together. The moral core is shared by design. The covenant is not by design. Confusing the two, either by claiming Judaism owns all truth exclusively, or by claiming Judaism's covenant is just one more equally interchangeable spiritual path, misreads the Torah's own careful distinction, laid out in its own text at Genesis 9 and again at Sinai. Next episode, we'll discuss the actual documented history of the Tree of Life, where it came from, and who carried it into the Western esoteric tradition.